The chair was designed for 4 load-bearing limbs. I had 2. This was not an accident. I had been sitting in the Grand Tribunal chamber of the Galactic Concorde for 11 minutes, and in that time I had catalogued every detail of the chair. The forward tilt. The width of the seat. The material, which was either ceramic or something that wanted to be ceramic when it grew up. The way the armrests were positioned at a height that worked perfectly for a species that had never heard of a human shoulder. I focused on the chair. There were 42 delegates in the room. 17 species. The ceiling was high enough that the upper third of it was lost in filtered light. The room smelled like ozone and cool metal, and underneath that, something faintly like the inside of a library. Old decisions. Held air. My name is Commander Ilara Voss, Defense Attaché of the Unified Earth Council. The only human in the building. The only human they had asked for. The Velthara prosecutor stood at the central dais and read the charges. The Velthara vocal register lands just below the threshold where sound becomes pain. Not sharp. Not loud. Sustained, the way a headache is sustained, the way you notice it not when it arrives but when it does not leave. I had learned to keep my jaw slightly loose when Velthara were speaking. It helped. A little. 40 minutes. I counted in my breathing. The charges were as follows. Engagement outside declared combat zones during the Keshri conflict. Deliberate neutralization of infrastructure classified as protected under Article 4 of the Galactic Combat Conventions. Psychological and information operations constituting prohibited treatment under Article 7. And finally, termination of a recognized armed conflict without oversight or mediation from the Concorde Bureau of Conflict Resolution. That last one. The room held it differently than the others. I watched that. The small shift in posture from the Thranosai delegation. The way the Velthara representative in the gallery, row 3, seat 7, went very still. He was not the prosecutor. He was a representative of a species that had been in a territorial conflict for 22 years. Under the conventions. Under Concorde guidance. 22 years. He had been watching me since I walked in. I had been watching him back. The Thranosai lead delegate sat directly across the primary bench. His name, transliterated, was something like Velorith, but the official record listed him as Senior Delegate Orith. He had been in the Concorde for his entire career. Over 400 years of institutional history behind his eyes. Everything about him said, I have watched species like yours walk through this door before, and I have watched all of them learn what they needed to learn, and you are not different. He slid the document across the table. Bound spine. Specific font. The smell reached me before my hands did. Ozone. Something powdery underneath it. I knew that smell. It was the smell of official Concorde printing materials. The same smell as the welcome package they had given us 8 years ago, when Earth first joined the Concorde and sat down at the table and was handed 6,000 pages of galactic law and told, warmly and with great care, that we were welcome here. I had been 26 when I walked into that first orientation. Dress uniform. Slightly too formal. Slightly too human for the room. I had believed every word they told us that day. I picked up the document. The Galactic Combat Conventions. 3,200 years old. 140 signatory species. I read the first page. The second. I set it down. Do you understand the charges as read? The prosecutor said. I looked at Delegate Orith. He was very still. Sure, I said. Absolutely. My assent was entered into the official record. In the gallery, the Velthara representative had not moved. 22 years. His species had a word for what his expression was doing, but no human language had a clean translation for it. The closest English equivalent our interpreter had offered was something between exhausted and watching something end that should have ended a long time ago. I pushed the document back to the center of the table. Here's the thing about that, I said. Delegate Orith looked up from his notes. We would like to respond to each charge individually, I said. In full. In context. The tribunal will allow it, he said. Tribunals always allow it. That is what they are for. Controlled space. Managed process. Every voice in its designated turn, and the result decided long before the first word is spoken, if you know how these rooms work. I had done my reading. Then I want to start, I said, at the beginning. Not the Keshri attack. Not the battle logs. Not the 11 months. The real beginning. The day we arrived, believed everything we were told, and started learning. 8 years before that tribunal room, I was a lieutenant with a new uniform and a poorly timed case of optimism. The Concord orientation program for new member species ran for 6 weeks. It was held on a station called Meridian Gate, which orbited a star so steady and old that the Concord had named it Constancy. The station had been hosting new member orientations for 900 years. They had the process down. Every surface was calibrated to some median of multi-species comfort. The lighting was precise. The documentation was thorough. The documentation was the part one remember most clearly now. Week 1 was governance. Week 2 was trade and resource law. Week 3 was cultural exchange protocols, which were genuinely interesting and which I would have enjoyed more if I had not been sitting next to a Velhari diplomat who processed air through a secondary membrane with a sound like slow, wet applause. Week 4 was enforcement mechanisms. Week 5 was conflict resolution law. Week 5. That was the week they handed us the Galactic Combat Conventions. The lead instructor that week was a Thranosci academic named Celerith. He was the first Thranosci I had ever spoken to at length. He had a careful way of explaining things, the kind that left no room for misunderstanding without feeling condescending, which is harder to do than it sounds. He liked Earth, I think. Or he liked how curious we were. He said once that new species asked better questions than established ones because they had not yet learned which questions were considered impolite. He said this kindly. I wrote it down. The Galactic Combat Conventions were, as a document, genuinely impressive. 3,000 years of accumulated galactic wisdom about how war should be conducted. Protected infrastructure. Designated zones. Civilian safeguards. Minimum response windows. Mandatory third-party mediation after 18 months. Exit frameworks. Ceasefire protocols. The whole architecture of how rational species, when they could not avoid conflict, chose to conduct it in a way that limited suffering and preserved the possibility of eventual peace. I had read the whole thing. Both nights they gave us to study it. Celerith asked at the end of week 5 if there were questions. I raised my hand and asked one question. The mediation trigger, I said. The 18-month requirement. Is the intent to begin mediation at 18 months, or to conclude it? He looked at me for a moment. To begin it, he said. Resolution timelines vary. What is the average resolution timeline? I asked. He told me. I did not write that one down. I did not need to. It was the kind of number that stays in the body rather than the notes. 4.3 years. From mediation start to signed resolution. On average. Which meant, start to finish, the average war under the Galactic Combat Conventions lasted just under 6 years. Minimum. I said thank you and sat down. Lieutenant Gary Pelham, sitting beside me, leaned over and said under his breath, "That seems long." "Yes," I said. "What happens if you do not want to wait 6 years?" he said. "You read Article 2, subsection 9, I said. He looked at me. "Do not worry about it," I said. I was lying. I was already worrying about it. But I was 26, and the room smelled like ozone and careful organization, and I was a junior officer on a peace assignment, and the Keshri War was not a thing yet. It was not even a possibility yet. Varith 4 was just a colony. I did not know its name would matter to me the way it does. That was year 0. The year we arrived. Believed everything. Started learning. Year 1 began with the Keshri Dominion. They were an old species. Older than humanity's written records. They had been in the Concord for 600 years, and in that time had expanded their territorial control by absorbing 14 smaller colonial systems. Not through negotiation. Through force. Through wars they started, ran through the conventions, and concluded with mediator-approved treaties that gave them incremental territory each time. It was, if you read the pattern without sentiment, efficient. They hit Verith 4 on a Thursday. Human time. The colony there was civilian, mostly. Researchers and families, about 8,000 people, and a small defense garrison under Colonel Owen Hart, who had 12 years of service and a coffee maker that he had somehow carried from Earth to that post and which produced the worst coffee I had ever tasted, but which he defended as though it were a member of his unit. I was in Hart's garrison. Lieutenant Alara Voss, 28 years old, 2 years since orientation, 6 months on Verith 4, and I had been awake for 19 hours when the first strike hit the outer perimeter. The strike was conventional. Precisely calibrated to the parameters of the Galactic Combat Conventions. No civilian areas in the first wave. No power grid. No water infrastructure. Every targeting decision pointed at military assets in designated zones. By the book. Hart read the strike report and said, very quietly, "They have done this before." He was right. They had done this 14 times. To 14 species. Through the conventions. With mediators. One incremental victory at a time. The Concord mediators arrived at month 19. On schedule. According to protocol. They were professional. They were thorough. They had a mediation framework prepared. Average resolution timeline, 4.3 years. Hart looked at that framework and said something I will not repeat in a legal document. Then he looked at me. "I need someone to read the conventions again," he said. "All of it. Every word. Not for what it says. For what it does not say." That was the project. That was how it started. Not with a plan. Not with ambition. With a colonel who could not afford a 6-year war and a lieutenant who had been asking the wrong version of the right question since orientation. I read the conventions again. All 6,000 pages. I read the Concord Charter. The founding documents. The commentary volumes. The dissenting opinions filed by member species over 300 years. And I read Article 2, subsection 9, which I had noticed at orientation and which Gary Pelham had never actually gone back and looked up. It was the amendment right. Any Concord member species could propose an alternative framework to standing conventions, provided they had the support of 3 or more other member species and submitted documentation through official channels. 3 signatures. That was the door. I brought it to Hart. He read it twice. "Find me 3 species who are tired of 6-year wars," he said. "I think I know where to start," I said. He said, "Good. And bring me something to write with." That was month 6 of the Keshri conflict. We had work to do. The Ares Accords were 14 pages long. The Galactic Combat Conventions were 6,000 pages long. I want you to think about that difference for a moment. 14 pages is not careless. 14 pages is surgical. 14 pages means you knew exactly what you were cutting and exactly why, and you did not waste a single word on anything you could not justify with a direct line from cause to effect. We wrote them over the course of 2 months. Hart and I, and a military analyst named Laura Marsh, who had a postdoctoral background in conflict theory and a personality like a steel beam wrapped in politeness, and who caught 3 structural errors in our first draft that would have made the whole thing unenforceable. We named it after the old concept. Not because we were sentimental. Because the name was accurate. Ares was not the god of war in the way people usually mean that phrase. He was the force that broke what could not be allowed to continue. We thought that was right. The principles were not complicated. That was the point of them. Principle 1, a war that ends is better than a war that is managed. This sounds like something someone would put on a wall plaque. It is not. It is the single most radical statement in the document, because it places the standard of success not on process compliance but on outcome. The Galactic Combat Conventions judged a conflict by how well it followed the rules. The Ares Accords judged a conflict by whether it stopped. Principle 2, protecting infrastructure that sustains a military campaign is not a humanitarian action. This was the charge the tribunal would focus on most. The conventions protected power grids, food distribution, water systems. This was reasonable, because civilians depend on those systems. We did not disagree with that. We disagreed with what happened when those systems also sustained the war machine. There is a difference between the hospital and the factory producing weapons. There is a difference between the water treatment plant and the fuel depot keeping the fleet running. The conventions drew no line between them. They were all protected infrastructure. The Ares Accords drew the line. And they drew it with the condition that the conventions had never required a 72-hour civilian evacuation window before any strike on dual-use infrastructure. Mandatory. Verified by human monitors. Publicly announced. The evacuation window was non-negotiable. What happened after it was. Principle 3. The goal is the enemy's decision to stop. Not their destruction. Not their collapse. Their decision. This was what Laura Marsh called the philosophical core of the document. She said it was also the most historically sound principle in it, because every war in recorded history had ended the same way. Not when one side ran out of soldiers or weapons or land, but when the decision-makers on one side concluded that continuing would cost more than stopping. You do not end a war by breaking a people. You end a war by changing the calculation for the people who are choosing to continue it. Every tactic, every permission, every restriction in the Ares Accords was oriented toward one outcome, making the continuation of the conflict more costly than its conclusion, as fast as possible, for the party who started it. Principle 4. No mandatory third-party mediation before 12 months. Not 18 months. 12. And not mandatory at 12 months either. Available at 12 months, if both parties agreed. If one party rejected mediation, the conflict continued under Accords guidelines without a Concord mediator extending timelines. Hart had very specific opinions about this principle. He expressed them in terms I edited from the official document but preserved in my personal notes. Laura Marsh added the provision I thought was the cleverest thing in the whole Accords. She called it the Transparency Clause. Under the Ares Accords, all conflict actions, all targeting decisions, all evacuation windows, all tactical choices were logged in real time and submitted to a public Concord record. Not reviewed by a mediation bureau. Just recorded. Visible to any member species who wanted to look. Accountability without gatekeepers. She described it with the precision of someone who has thought about it at length and no longer needs to perform enthusiasm because the work is self-evident. I asked her once if she had always thought this way about conflict. She said, I read the casualty reports from the 14 species the Keshri had absorbed. Then I read the timeline for each conflict. Then I read the mediator billing records. She said it the way you say things that do not need emphasis. We had 3 co-signing species before the document was finished. One of them was the Velthera. 22 years. The Velthera representative in the gallery, row 3, seat 7, had been fighting that war since before I was in uniform. He had lost 2 siblings to it. His delegation had been requesting accelerated mediation for 11 years and had been told, on 11 separate occasions, that the timeline for resolution required more process. More rounds. More documentation. He read 14 pages and signed the same day. Now let me tell you about the 11 months. Hart submitted the Ares Accords to the Concord through official channels on the first day of year 2 of the Keshri conflict. The Concord's response was 12 pages of procedural objections and a recommendation that we continue operating under existing conventions while the review process was conducted. The review process had no stated deadline. We continued operating under the Accords anyway. Month 1, we mapped the Keshri supply infrastructure. Not to destroy it. To understand what was sustaining the campaign as opposed to the civilian population. The distinction was real, and the mapping took 3 weeks, and at the end of it we had a document that separated one from the other with clear criteria. Month 2, we severed the military supply lines. Not destroyed. Severed. Rerouted. Blocked. The Keshri could rebuild them the moment they chose to. That was the point. We wanted them to have the choice. Month 3, we announced the first evacuation window. 72 hours. Public notification on all channels. Civilian movement assisted by our logistics teams. 800,000 people moved in 11 days. 11 days. The Concord Bureau of Conflict Resolution was, at this point, still processing the paperwork to authorize their observation team. Month 4, the Keshri began repositioning. Not retreating. Repositioning. They were testing our targeting logic. Seeing if we would follow the distinction we had claimed we were making. We followed it. Exactly. Month 5, Hart received a message from a Keshri general through a back channel that both sides pretended did not exist. The message was not a peace offer. It was a question. Specifically, it asked whether our actions were consistent with the document we had filed or whether they reflected a broader campaign intent. Hart wrote back in 3 sentences. Quoted the relevant principle. Closed with, "The decision is yours when you are ready to make it." Month 7, the Keshri government requested informal talks. Not Concord mediation. Direct contact. Human to Keshri. We sent Laura Marsh. Month 8, we went back to Verith 4. I was in the first unit through the gates. The city was intact. The evacuation window had worked. The targeting doctrine had held. The civilian infrastructure had not been touched, because it had never appeared on our target list, because we had done the mapping and drawn the line and held it for 8 months without exception. Intact. Month 9, the Keshri government made the decision. Month 11, the armistice was signed. Direct negotiation. No mediators. No extension of timelines. The Keshri conflict ended. I sat in the armistice room and listened to the final language read aloud, and I thought about Celerith at orientation, explaining the average resolution timeline of 4.3 years. I thought about how he had looked at me when I asked the question. I thought about Gary Pelham beside me in that classroom. "That seems long," he had said. He was right. He had always been right about that. There was nothing that needed saying in the armistice room. There would be, later. The tribunal reconvened after a 3-hour recess, which the Concord scheduling system had blocked as administrative processing time and which I had spent in a corridor outside the chamber eating a nutrition bar I had brought from the ship. The bar was compressed soy and something nutritionally equivalent to oats and tasted like neither. I ate it slowly because I was not hungry, and eating slowly when you are not hungry occupies time better than eating quickly. I had learned this on deployments. Time management is mostly just finding the version of waiting that feels least like waiting. Nora Finch came and sat beside me. She was our legal officer, 31 years old, from a small town in the north of England, and she had a quality I had always valued in colleagues, which was that she said exactly what she needed to say and not a single syllable more. She sat down, looked straight ahead, and said, "They are going to find us guilty." "I know," I said. "The charge they care about is the last one," she said. "I know," I said. "And you have a plan," she said. I offered her part of the nutrition bar. She took it. "Tell me the plan," I said. She chewed for a moment and said, "That is either very good or it will make everything significantly worse." "Those are usually the same plan," I said. She did not disagree. We went back in. Delegate Orith opened the afternoon session with a formality that was almost theatrical. I do not mean that as a criticism. Formality in rooms like this is functional. It creates the impression that what happens next is the result of considered process rather than concluded judgment. It is the architecture of legitimacy. I respect it the way you respect a well-built structure even when you are planning to walk out the other side of it. "Commander Voss," he said. "The tribunal has reviewed the morning record. Before we proceed to your formal response, we would like to ask a direct question." "Go ahead," I said. "Earth has never signed the Galactic Combat Conventions," he said. "This is documented fact. Earth joined the Concord 8 years ago and submitted no reservation, no formal objection, and no alternative proposal at the time of joining. The tribunal would like to understand, did Earth consider itself bound by the conventions?" The room was quiet. I had been waiting for this question since before I walked in. Not because it was a trap, exactly. Because it was the question that contained the answer. Ask the right question in the wrong direction and you hand your opponent the frame. "May I ask a question first?" I said. Orith considered it. "You may." "The Galactic Combat Conventions," I said. "Ratified 3,200 years ago. 140 signatory species. When was the last time a war under the conventions was concluded without Concord mediation?" Silence. "I have the figure," I said. "But I would prefer to hear it from the tribunal's record." Orith looked at a secondary delegate to his right. The delegate checked a reference panel. 412 years ago, the delegate said. Thank you, I said. And in that 412-year period, how many conflicts have been initiated and concluded under the conventions? A longer pause. 347, the delegate said. And of those 347, I said, how many reached full cessation, meaning no ongoing hostilities, no suspended armistice, no active mediation extension, within 5 years of initiation? The delegate checked again. Checked once more. 11, the delegate said. 11, I said. Out of 347. I did not lean forward. I did not raise my voice. I kept my hands flat on the table. The Keshri conflict is not on that list, I said. Because it ended in 11 months. Which, by the standards of this room, is apparently the crime we are here to discuss. Orith said, Commander, the question was whether Earth considered itself bound by the conventions. And the answer is that we read them, I said. The whole document. 6,000 pages. We read the provisions. We read the history. We read the bilateral agreements, the resolution records, the mediation billing structures. We read everything. I let that sit for a moment. What we found, I said, is that the Galactic Combat Conventions are a very good document for maintaining conflict within acceptable parameters. They are not, by any measure in the record, an effective document for ending conflict. That is an interpretation, Orith said. It is arithmetic, I said. Delegate Orith was still. The particular stillness of someone choosing not to respond to something they do not want in the record. So I put it in the record myself. Over the next 40 minutes, I walked the tribunal through what I had found in the Concord archives. I did not accuse. I did not allege. I read numbers. The Concord Bureau of Conflict Resolution, 4.4 million employees. Operational budget funded by a direct levy on active conflict parties. The more parties in active conflict, the larger the budget. The longer the conflict, the longer the levy. The Bureau's 3 highest funded years in the last century were years when 7 or more major conflicts were simultaneously in active mediation. The Protected Infrastructure Clause, I had gone back to the drafting records. The original debate over the clause, 1700 years ago. The arguments made for broad infrastructure protection. The species that pushed hardest for the broad definition. 2 of them were major suppliers of conflict-related logistics contracts. Their involvement in the drafting was not hidden. It was not publicized. The 18-month mediation trigger, I had the resolution records for every conflict in the last 400 years. The average time from mediation initiation to signed resolution was 4.3 years. Of the 347 conflicts concluded in that period, 219 had been extended beyond initial resolution timelines due to what the Bureau classified as process complexity. Process complexity. I had brought the actual definition from the Bureau manual. Process complexity meant, in formal language, that one or both parties required additional facilitation cycles before reaching decision alignment. Decision alignment, I said. In plain language, one or both parties were not ready to stop. And the conventions required the mediators to keep facilitating until they were, regardless of the cost to anyone outside the negotiating room. The room was very quiet. The conventions protect civilians, Orith said. That is their primary purpose. The conventions protect civilians within active conflict, I said. They do not appear to place equivalent value on ending the conditions that put civilians at risk in the first place. The Ares Accords do both. You had no authority to operate under an unratified framework, he said. We had 3 co-signing species, I said. Per Article 14 of the Concord Charter, any member species may propose an alternative framework to standing conventions with the support of 3 or more members. We submitted the documentation. The Bureau acknowledged receipt. The review process was opened. It was not concluded, he said. No, I said. It was not concluded. But the Keshri conflict was. A sound from the gallery. I looked. The Velthara representative. Row 3, seat 7. He had made no sound all morning. He made one now. Low, sustained, the specific register that his species used in contexts humans had learned to read as something between grief and recognition. Orith looked at the gallery. Then back at me. Commander, he said, and his voice had shifted in a way that told me we were done with the formal portion of his strategy and into the part he did not want on the record. The concern of this tribunal is not only the Keshri conflict. The concern is precedent. There it was. Other species, he said, are now citing your conduct as grounds for seeking exemptions from their current mediation obligations. 3 separate member species have formally requested Bureau review of their conflict timelines based on what they are describing as the Earth precedent. I am aware, I said. Do you understand what that means for galactic stability? He said. I looked at him. His species had been in the Concord for 1,000 years. His species had never been in a losing war. His species sat on the Bureau Oversight Committee and had for 4 centuries. His species did not have a conflict currently in mediation. I think I understand it better than you would prefer, I said. Nora Finch, behind me, was very carefully writing something down. The conventions exist, Orith said, because species that do not follow agreed rules produce wars that do not end. Rules exist for a reason. Yes, I said. They do. I put my copy of the Ares Accords on the table. So do these, I said. In the gallery, the Velthara representative stood up. It was not his turn to speak. There was no protocol in the chamber for a gallery observer to stand without recognition. Everyone in the room knew this. Everyone in the room looked at him. He said one word. Our interpreter said afterward that it meant approximately, enough. Not as an opinion. As a declaration. He said it the way you say a thing that has been true for a very long time and that you have been waiting, with diminishing patience, for someone with the right standing to finally say out loud. I looked at Delegate Orith. He was looking at the Velthara representative. For the first time since I had walked in, something moved behind his eyes that was not control. We will recess, he said, until tomorrow morning. I said nothing. I gathered my papers and stood up from the chair designed for 4 load-bearing limbs. My spine made its feelings known, briefly. I did not respond to it. I had work to do before morning. Morning in the Concord station came with a lighting shift. Not sunrise. The station had no windows on the tribunal level. But the automated systems cycled from the dim maintenance period into full operating light at 600 station time, and the change in the corridor outside my assigned room was abrupt enough to read as a kind of announcement. I had not slept much. That was not unusual for me before significant days. It had not been unusual since Varith 4. I had a tolerance for it by now. There is a version of tired that is just the condition of being present and awake when the world needs you to be, and you carry it the way you carry anything necessary. Nora Finch knocked at 0545. I opened the door. She had a coffee in each hand. Station coffee, which was made by a machine that tried to approximate the human formula and produce something that tasted like the memory of coffee as recalled by someone who had never actually tasted it. I took mine without comment. The Velthara delegation filed a formal motion last night, she said. At 0230 station time. I know, I said. You know because you were awake at 0230, she said. Correct, I said. She looked at me. The motion requests immediate review of the Ares Accords under the Article 14 process. They have attached supporting statements from 2 additional member species. That gives us 5 co-signatories. 6, I said. The Dorith submitted their statement at 0410. She processed this. That is 6, she said. Yes, I said. She drank her coffee. The Bureau will fight it, she said. They will try, I said. Orith will argue process, she said. He will say the review is premature. He will say the existing ratification structure requires a longer consultation period. He will produce 300 years of precedent for why new frameworks cannot be rushed. He will be right on all of those points, I said. She looked at me again. And, she said. And none of them are disqualifying, I said. Article 14 does not require the Bureau's approval for a framework to be submitted. It requires documentation, co-signatures, and formal notice. We have all 3. The review timeline is at the Bureau's discretion. The framework's validity is not. She set down her coffee. You are going to tell them, she said, that they can take as long as they want to review it, and in the meantime, any species that chooses to operate under the Ares Accords is doing so with the legal standing of a submitted alternative framework. Submitted, documented, and co-signed by 6 member species, I said. She was quiet for a moment. That is going to be very unpopular, she said. Sure, I said. Absolutely. She almost smiled. It was the kind of almost that told me everything about how the morning was going to go. We walked in together at 900. The tribunal chamber was fuller than the day before. 6 additional observer seats had been filled overnight. 2 species whose delegations I did not recognize. The Velthera section had expanded. 3 more representatives where one had been yesterday. Delegate Orith was already seated. He had the look of a man who had also not slept and who was considerably less experienced at wearing it. He opened the session with the same formality as the day before. I credited him for that. Whatever he had been doing since yesterday's recess, he had not allowed it to change his tone in the room. This tribunal has reviewed the motions filed overnight, he said. We note that several are procedurally irregular and will require additional review before they can be entered into the formal record. Understood, I said. Additionally, he said, the tribunal has completed its deliberation on the charges filed against Commander Ilara Voss and the Unified Earth Council. The room held itself. On the charge of engagement outside declared combat zones, he said, the tribunal finds the Earth Council in technical violation of the Galactic Combat Conventions, Article 3. I nodded. Wrote nothing down. On the charge of neutralization of protected infrastructure, he said, the tribunal finds the actions taken were conducted with documented civilian evacuation protocols and therefore enters a finding of partial violation, with mitigating factors noted. Partial. I had not expected partial. That was Nora Finch's work in the pre-hearing filings. I would tell her later that she had earned whatever she planned to eat for dinner. On the charge of prohibited psychological and information operations, he said, the tribunal finds insufficient evidence of intent to cause prohibited harm and enters a finding of not established. I kept my face still. On the final charge, he said, and paused, termination of the Keshri conflict without Concord oversight or mediation approval. The room was absolutely quiet. The tribunal finds the Earth Council in violation of the Galactic Combat Conventions, Article 12, governing conflict resolution procedures. There it was. The recommended sanction, Orith said, is a formal censure, entered into the Concord record. A 10-year period of conflict protocol observation. And mandatory participation in Bureau mediation processes for any future conflict in which Earth is a party. He set down his notes. Do you have a response? He said. I looked at him. He looked back. For a moment, across the bench, it was just 2 people who understood the room they were in and what it meant and what the next words would cost. Yes, I said. Thank you. I stood up. Not for effect. My spine needed it after 2 days in that chair. The Earth Council accepts the tribunal's findings, I said. We note the mitigating determinations in the record. We do not contest the technical finding on Article 12. Oritha's posture shifted slightly. What we would like to formally enter, I said, is the submission of the Ares Accords for ratification under Article 14 of the Concord Charter. I put the document on the table. As an alternative framework, I said, open to voluntary adoption by all member species. Filed with 6 co-signatory statements. Submitted through official documentation as required. We are not asking the Bureau to approve it. We are entering it into the record, as we are entitled to do. The review process for alternative frameworks, Orith said, can take years, I said. I know. Take the time you need. I looked at the document on the table. 14 pages. It looked very small against the surface of that bench. In the meantime, I said, the framework is filed. Any species operating under it is operating under a submitted, documented, co-signed alternative. That is the legal standard. Not Bureau approval. Not tribunal endorsement. The standard is in the charter, and the documentation is in the record. The room did not erupt. This was not the moment for eruption. That had been last night, in the filing of motions at 0230 and 0410 and whatever hour the 6th signature had come in. The room now was the morning after all that. Still and changed. Delegate Orith looked at the document. He looked at me. I looked back. There was something in his face that I spent a long time afterward trying to find the right word for. Not anger. Not defeat. Something closer to the expression of a very experienced navigator who has just realized that the map he has been using for 1,000 years has a feature on it that was never named and that does not behave the way the surrounding terrain suggested it would. Not hostility. Recognition. He said, "The submission is entered into the record." 6 words. No elaboration. No procedural objection. No countermotion. Entered into the record. I sat back down. In the gallery, the Velthara representative was still standing. He had stood since yesterday afternoon and no procedural rule had been invoked to seat him, possibly because no one wanted to be the person who told him to sit after 22 years of the alternative. He was looking at the Ares Accords on the table. I looked at him. He looked at me. I thought about Celerith at orientation. The question I had asked. The number he gave me. 4.3 years. The look on his face after, which I had not understood at 26 and which I understood very clearly now. Not disapproval. Not surprise. The expression of a person who has spent their career explaining a system and has just heard, for the first time, the question that the system could not cleanly answer. I thought about Gary Pelham beside me in that classroom saying that 6 years seemed long. He was right. He had always been right about that. He never got to know how right. I thought about Owen Hart and his terrible coffee and the 12 sentences he wrote on the first day of year 2 when I brought him Article 14. Not the plan. The door. And he had taken it and turned it into something that outlasted both of us getting through this conflict in one piece. I thought about Laura Marsh explaining the transparency clause with the calm of a person who has done the math and the math is simply true, without performance, without drama, because drama is what you reach for when the facts are not enough, and in her experience the facts were always enough. I thought about the city. Month 8. First unit through the gates. The smell of the place in the early morning when we came through. The specific quality of light in a settlement that has been empty for months and then filled again. The absence that had been there, and then was not. 8,000 people, mostly researchers and families who had spent nearly a year waiting to come back to something they had built. The city was intact. That was what 11 months was for. That was what the Ares Accords were built to do, end the thing before the thing consumed everything worth coming back to. The conventions would have had us in mediation for 4 more years after that. For more years of designated zones and protected infrastructure and managed continuation and bureau billing cycles. For more years of a city sitting empty on the edge of a conflict that had a framework and a process and an average resolution timeline that nobody in the mediation bureau found troubling. 11 months. We brought them home in 11 months. The tribunal is adjourned, Orith said. He stood. The procedural tradition required the delegates to stand when the presiding officer stood. They stood. 17 species. 42 delegates. The Velthara representative was already standing. He looked at me one more time. Then he looked at the document on the table. Then he walked out of the gallery and toward the main floor, which was not procedure, and which no one stopped him from doing, and he picked up the copy of the Ares Accords and held it the way you hold something you have been waiting for without knowing exactly what shape it would take when it arrived. I let him. Outside the chamber, in the corridor, Nora Finch fell into step beside me. She had her notes tucked under her arm and was doing the calculation in her head that I could see on her face and that I had been running myself since 0230. How long before the first species files for framework adoption, she said. The Velthara are writing the motion now, I said. My estimate is 48 hours. The Bureau will file a procedural challenge, she said. Yes, I said. It will go to the full Council Review Board, she said. Yes, I said. That takes approximately 6 months, she said. Unless 3 or more additional species file in support of the framework, I said. In which case the Charter mandates an expedited review. She walked beside me for a moment. How many more do you expect, she said. 3 species were currently in conflicts over 6 years old. 2 more were in the early stages of engagements where the pattern was recognizable to anyone who had seen it before. One had been in suspended armistice for 11 years, which in bureau language meant a war that had been paused but was still being managed, still being billed for, still tethered to a process with no stated endpoint. Enough, I said. She nodded. The corridor light was the full operational cycle now. Bright and steady, without any quality of mercy or drama. Just light. The kind that shows you exactly what is in front of you and asks you to deal with it accordingly. The censure goes on the record, she said. It does, I said. Does that bother you, she said. I thought about Gary Pelham. I thought about the city. I thought about 11 months and 14 pages and 3 people at a table who had decided that a 6,000-page document and a 400-year track record of managed, sustained, never quite finished conflict was not the same thing as a solution. No, I said. She accepted this. We walked to the end of the corridor where there was a window. Not on the tribunal level, which had none, but at the end of the administrative wing, a long narrow panel that looked out onto the station's exterior ring and, beyond it, at the star called Constancy. The same star I had looked at from orientation, 8 years ago. When I was 26 and the room smelled like ozone and the future was an orderly place that had already been mapped and all you had to do was follow it. Nora Finch looked at the star. What happens now, she said. The question was large enough to contain several answers. She knew which one she was asking for. Now, I said, we go home and wait. For what, she said. For the second species to file, I said. And the third. And the fourth. And then, she said. I looked at the window. A tribunal finds you guilty of ending a war too fast. The conventions say you broke the rules. The conventions are 3,000 years old and written by species who have spent 3,000 years in managed, maintained, sustained conflict under the care of a bureau that measures success in resolution cycles and budget approvals. And you stood up in that room and you said, here is what we wrote instead. 14 pages. The door is open. Walk through it when you are ready. Then, I said, someone else walks through the door. Nora Finch was quiet for a moment. You are smiling, she said. I was. I had not noticed. I turned away from the window and started walking toward the ship. We had a long way home.